Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and watching our channel. For most of us, when we hear about a defense procurement contract, we tend to think of it as a matter of numbers. How many aircraft, how many billions of dollars, how many years until deployment. Dense technical terminology, reports that seem written only for generals, officials, and experts. For the majority of ordinary people, it feels like a distant, dry story, somewhere far removed from everyday life, where gasoline prices, rent, or winter heating bills are what truly demand attention. But there are moments when, if we pause long enough, that story suddenly changes color. It is no longer about metal, propellers, or jet engines. It becomes a story about the invisible line between being allowed and deciding for oneself. About whether a nation truly controls its own skies or is merely permitted to use them under conditions set by someone else. Sovereignty, in its deepest sense, is not a decorative concept in textbooks or a solemn phrase in a constitution. Sovereignty is the ability to choose in the most difficult moments. It is the right to say no without paying the price of economic paralysis. It is the ability to defend one's territory without having to look to another capital, waiting for a signal of approval. And it is precisely here that Canada's story begins to grow troubling. Because at this moment, we are not simply facing a procurement decision. We are standing in the middle of a chessboard, where the pieces are not only fighter jets, but jobs, exports, supply chains, and the livelihoods of millions of people. A chessboard where Canada's largest trading partner has set aside its familiar diplomatic tone and shifted to a more blunt language, the language of conditions and consequences. When a military decision becomes tightly bound to economic leverage, the line between cooperation and imposition begins to blur. When a country cannot freely reconsider its choices without fearing punishment, the question is no longer about the quality of the aircraft, but about the degree of freedom in national policy itself. The most frightening thing is not the pressure applied in a single deal. It is the creeping sense that somewhere along the way, a sky once considered our own is gradually becoming a conditional space. That every independent decision must be weighed against the reaction of a stronger partner, and that the cost of hesitation is not measured only in money, but in a slow erosion of self-determination over time. It is from this very moment, when the innocence of a so-called equal alliance begins to crack, that the story is forced to turn a new page. A page where we must confront an uncomfortable reality head-on. What happens when alliances are no longer guided by mutual respect, but by public ultimatums instead? In a world where we still want to believe that shared norms exist, relations between allied nations are meant to be built on mutual respect. Disagreements can be fierce behind closed doors. Arguments can arise over costs, timelines, or strategic priorities. But once leaders step into the public eye, what is preserved is always the appearance of equality. This is not merely diplomatic etiquette, it is the fragile glue that allows the very idea of an alliance to retain its meaning. Canada acted according to that logic. When Ottawa signaled its intention to pause and review its choice of fighter aircraft, a decision that is entirely legitimate, even necessary in responsible governance, no one could reasonably call it betrayal or a turning away. It was a duty to taxpayers, to long-term security, and to national sovereignty itself. In a healthy alliance, that moment should have opened the door to dialogue, more data, more arguments, more compromise. But what happened was the complete opposite. The response did not come in the form of technical discussions or discrete explanations. It arrived as a public message, clear to the point of coldness. Either follow the preferred choice or accept the trade consequences. No subtle hints, no diplomatic detours. A direct linkage between a military contract and the economic lifeblood of an entire nation. That moment marked a dangerous slide. Because when an ambassador or senior official stands before international media and openly ties security decisions to economic punishment, we are no longer talking about soft pressure. We are talking about coercion. And coercion, no matter how it is wrapped in the language of shared interests or collective security, remains coercion. For a country as economically open as Canada, trade leverage is not an abstract threat. It reaches directly into factories, ports, and farms, into the jobs of people who have never read a single line about air power doctrine or Arctic strategy. That is why the weight of such an ultimatum lies not in its wording, but in a very real fear. If we say no, how high will the price be? What is even more troubling than a decision made under pressure is the precedent it creates. Today it is fighter jets. Tomorrow it could be energy infrastructure. The day after, telecommunications, data, or other core technology sectors. Once a great power realizes that economic leverage can force an ally's compliance in defense matters, the moral boundaries of an alliance begin to dissolve rapidly. At that point, the concept of an ally is reduced to an unequal transaction. One side holds the power to set conditions. The other bears the responsibility to accept them or face the consequences. And when choice is squeezed that tightly, sovereignty does not vanish overnight. It is eroded bit by bit in silence until people grow accustomed to having no real alternatives at all. It is precisely here that a deeper question emerges, one that goes beyond diplomacy or trade. If a country can be pressured simply through a procurement decision, then what is truly being purchased? Aircraft or long-term dependence? And that dependence does not exist only at the negotiating table. It sinks deep into the very structure of the weapons we call national assets. Because once we move beyond the political layer and into the true nature of these modern machines, an even more unsettling truth comes into view. Power does not reside only in contracts. It lives in source code, in software, in the invisible systems that control everything, from the moment an aircraft takes off to the moment it is forced to remain grounded on the runway. And from that moment on, the story no longer ends with ultimatums. It shifts to something far more subtle and far more dangerous: digital dependence. When people talk about next-generation fighter jets, the imagination usually stops at supersonic speed, stealth capabilities, or spectacular displays in the sky. But that is only the most glamorous outer shell. The truth lies much deeper in places the naked eye cannot see, and that rarely appear in press releases. Modern fighter aircraft are no longer pure metal machines controlled solely by a pilot's skill. They are complex digital systems where software, data, and network connectivity are vital, often even more important than the engines or the weapons they carry. Every flight today is the result of millions of lines of code. From flight control systems and radar to electronic warfare and real-time threat analysis, everything depends on algorithms that are constantly updated. An aircraft no longer simply flies. It communicates, learns, synchronizes, and responds within a vast network that extends far beyond national borders. And it is precisely here that the concept of ownership begins to blur. Owning an aircraft on paper does not mean truly controlling it in reality. When source code is out of reach, when software updates require external approval, when critical components are classified as sensitive and cannot be produced independently, operational control exists only within permitted conditions. In peacetime, this may go unnoticed. Everything runs smoothly. Maintenance schedules are followed. Upgrades arrive regularly, presented as proof of cooperation. Yet that very smoothness conceals a fragile reality. All it takes is a software patch delayed for technical reasons. All it takes is a shipment of components held back for procedural review. All it takes is an administrative decision issued amid political disagreement. No shots need to be fired. No declaration of war is required. An entire squadron can be brought to a standstill, not because it is obsolete, but because it is locked into an ecosystem that the owning nation does not fully control. This is not a pessimistic hypothesis. It is logic deliberately built into the power structure of modern weapons. The term interoperability is often used as a symbol of modern alliances. Systems connect, share data, and coordinate seamlessly in joint operational scenarios. On the surface, it sounds like unity and efficiency. But behind that polished language lies a very clear hierarchy. Some countries define the standards, control the technological core, and hold the system keys. Others are allowed only to integrate, to operate within predefined limits. In that order, political disagreements no longer remain confined to negotiating tables. They can seep into lines of code, maintenance cycles, and upgrade decisions. Power no longer needs to appear as direct military force. It exists quietly, persistently, and far more difficult to resist, because it is embedded in the everyday operation of the very tools of defense. The most dangerous aspect of digital dependence is not that it triggers an immediate crisis. It is that it creates a false sense of security. The belief that we possess the most advanced technology, that we stand at the center of a powerful alliance network. But when a truly independent decision must be made, that is when the invisible constraints tightening around the freedom of choice finally become clear. And at that moment, the story moves beyond any single aircraft type. It becomes a story about the path a nation chooses for its future. Do we accept the role of a dependent customer, trading short-term convenience and externally guaranteed security for long-term reliance? Or are we willing to take a harder, slower road, one that preserves the space to build genuine capabilities of our own? Because when all the layers of technological complexity are stripped away, the issue is no longer about how fast an aircraft can fly or how effective its stealth may be. It is about the philosophy of power behind that choice. And from here, we are forced to confront two very different models, leading to two very different futures for sovereignty, for the economy, and for Canada's place in a world that is becoming increasingly unforgiving toward nations that lack true autonomy. When these two paths are placed side by side, the difference between them is not found in specification sheets or marketing promises. It lies in how a nation sees itself within the global order of power. One path views itself as a customer inside an ecosystem designed by others. The other sees itself as a partner with enough capacity to help shape the game, even if that means paying the price in time, money, and politically difficult decisions. The dependent customer model looks appealing at first glance. Everything comes neatly packaged. Cutting-edge technology, a complete logistics chain, security guarantees that sound reassuring. The purchasing nation simply signs the contract, pays on time, and operates according to instructions. In the short term, this is the path with the least political risk. No prolonged debates about domestic defense industries. No massive investments in research, training, or building complex supply chains. Everything is optimized for convenience. But that convenience carries a quiet cost. When all core knowledge resides beyond national borders, when every upgrade depends on decisions made elsewhere, the buying nation gradually loses its bargaining power. It is not just purchasing a product, it is buying a lower position in the hierarchy of power. With each passing decade, that dependence does not fade, it accumulates. Eventually, even the question, do we have another option, becomes difficult to answer, because the capacity to choose no longer exists. By contrast, the capable partner model is a far rougher road. It demands prolonged political debate, large upfront investments, and patience from society itself. Building domestic capability does not deliver instant victories. It does not generate dramatic headlines in the short term. But every factory that is built, every engineer who is trained, every link in the value chain that is localized contributes to something money cannot buy overnight: autonomy. In this model, money does not simply flow outward and disappear. It circulates within the domestic economy, creating jobs, driving innovation, and allowing technology to spill over into civilian sectors. Knowledge is not locked away in thick contracts. It is accumulated, refined, and passed on to the next generation. Most importantly, the nation retains the right to choose in the most difficult moments, the right to adjust, the right to say, not yet, and if necessary, the right to say no. That is why the difference between the two models is not merely economic or technical. It is a difference in futures. One future understands sovereignty as the ability to operate within limits set by others. The other understands sovereignty as an internal capability, imperfect perhaps, but strong enough not to be suffocated by external pressure. Choosing between these two paths is never a purely military decision. It is always political, social, and moral. It reflects how much a nation is willing to invest in long-term independence rather than accept short-term security. And it reveals how much confidence we place in our own capabilities. Yet, all of these debates remain abstract unless they are grounded in a place where the consequences of choice become unmistakable, impossible to avoid. For Canada, that place is not a meeting room in Ottawa, nor the pages of defense contracts hundreds of pages long. It lies in a region that is cold, unforgiving, and increasingly strategic. A place where aircraft are not symbols of power, but tools of survival. Where sovereignty cannot be proclaimed, it must be exercised in reality. That place is the Arctic. The Arctic is not an abstract concept on a map. It is a vital living space where geography, climate, and politics collide head-on. As the ice melts with each passing summer, maritime routes that were frozen shut for centuries begin to open. What were once purely strategic hypotheses are now becoming reality. More ship traffic, increased exploration activity, and an ever more visible military presence by major powers. In this context, the Arctic is no longer a distant periphery of Canada. It has become the front line of national sovereignty. In such a harsh environment, slogans are meaningless if they are not backed by real capability. Sovereignty is not asserted through diplomatic statements or lines in international documents. It is measured by the ability to arrive on time, to maintain a sustained presence, and to respond independently when the worst-case scenario unfolds. And in every one of those situations, fighter aircraft are not merely symbols of power. They are the only means of connecting remote outposts to the national core, the eyes and the shield of Canada across a vast space where there is almost no margin for error. Imagine an incident occurring at a forward base, thousands of kilometers away from the industrial centers of the South. The weather is brutal. Temperatures drop so low that metal becomes brittle and components are pushed far beyond normal testing conditions. In that situation, the question is no longer how advanced the aircraft is, but who actually has the authority to repair it, replace parts, and make decisions. Canadian engineers with domestically available components or a supply chain outside the country operating on schedules and priorities that do not always align with Ottawa's interests. It is in the Arctic that the difference between autonomy and dependence becomes impossible to ignore. A system in which every malfunction requires external approval will always be one step slower. And in a strategic environment, being one step behind can mean losing control, not because the adversary is stronger, but because we are not flexible enough to act when it matters. The Arctic also exposes the reality that alliances do not always function according to idealized scripts. When interests overlap, when priorities shift, each country ultimately looks after its own space first. In that moment, a nation can rely only on the capabilities it truly controls. No software update arrives on time if interests no longer align. No supply chain is prioritized when political pressure emerges elsewhere. That is why the Arctic becomes an unforgiving test of every choice made on paper. It turns what seem like abstract debates about technology, contracts, or alliances into very concrete questions. How long can we sustain a presence with what degree of independence and at what cost? Sovereignty here is no longer a legal concept. It is the ability to operate reliably under the harshest conditions when there is no time to wait or negotiate. Yet it is also at this point that another truth begins to emerge. Every decision about capability made today carries long-term constraints. Choices that appear to save time and money in the short term can become burdens that last for decades. The Arctic does not only test the ability to maintain presence, it exposes the true cost of dependence, a cost not paid immediately, but deferred into the future. And when we look beyond a single budget cycle or one government's term, a deeper question must be asked: who will bear those constraints? Who will pay the price for contracts that lock in choices, for systems with no exit options, for decisions made in the name of today's convenience? The answer does not lie with the generation signing the contracts, but with those who will inherit their consequences. And it is from here that the story must move to a deeper level still. The real cost that future generations of Canadians will be forced to carry. There is a very common illusion in major defense decisions. The feeling that once the contract is signed and the initial payment is made, the problem is essentially solved. Tens of billions of dollars are announced to the public, shocking for a few weeks, then gradually sinking into the background as a done deal. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. The real cost is not the entry fee. It lies in what follows, quietly, over time, and almost impossible to reverse. When a weapon system is designed as a closed ecosystem, time becomes an ally of the supplier, not of the purchasing nation. With each passing year, dependence deepens. Every upgrade is no longer a choice, but an obligation. Every overhaul is no longer a negotiation, but a command already written into the contract. And when there is no competition, the concept of a reasonable price loses any real meaning. The generation making the decision today may not feel the full consequences firsthand, The costs are spread across decades, thin enough not to shock any single government term. But for the next generation, they become an unavoidable reality. They inherit constraints before they ever have the chance to question them. They step into the future with a system already locked in, where every alternative has become so expensive that it is almost impossible. What should concern us is not only the money, it is the opportunity cost that is lost. Every dollar forced into a monopolized system is a dollar that cannot be invested in domestic research, in training engineers, in industries capable of creating lasting value. Over the long term, this dependence does not just inflate the defense budget, it drains the economy of crucial drivers of innovation. There is an aspect that is rarely discussed, yet deeply moral in nature. When a nation accepts long-term constraints for the sake of short-term convenience, it transfers risk to those who had no voice in the decision. Young people today and generations not yet born will be the ones forced to navigate a narrowed policy space. They will have to defend sovereignty under harsher conditions, with fewer levers of influence and with a budget already pre-committed to obligations that cannot be undone. In that context, responsibility extends beyond technical or financial considerations. It becomes a question of intergenerational fairness. Do we have the right to lock in the future simply to avoid difficult debates today? Is the short-term peace of mind of the present worth trading for the long-term constraints imposed on our children and grandchildren? The true cost of dependence is never fully recorded in a budget spreadsheet. It exists in the choices that no longer exist, in debates that have lost their meaning because every alternative was eliminated long ago. It exists in the feeling that the country is still functioning normally, while the space for self-determination has quietly shrunk beyond easy recognition. And that is why, when we talk about the costs future generations will bear, we are not speaking only of dry numbers. We are talking about choices lost before they could ever be exercised. We are talking about a future in which every major decision must be weighed within the confines of old constraints. That is the greatest cost and the hardest to repair of the choices being made today. When all the layers of analysis are stripped away, what remains is not a specific aircraft, nor a contract filled with enormous numbers. What remains is a deeply human, fundamental question. Who do we want to be in this world? A nation confident in its own capabilities, willing to accept difficult choices in order to preserve self-determination, or a nation content with conditional security, as long as the price of dependence does not appear immediately before our eyes. Sovereignty, when examined deeply enough, has never been a gift that is handed out. It does not come from declarations of friendship, nor is it permanently guaranteed by any alliance. Sovereignty exists because of decisions that are often lonely, costly, and not always welcomed. It is built from internal capacity, from patient investment in the future, and from the courage to say no when pressure demands a yes. Canada can absolutely be a reliable ally and still remain an independent nation. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, history shows that the strongest allies are precisely those countries capable of standing on their own. A partner with real autonomy does not weaken an alliance, it makes it more balanced and more durable. By contrast, an alliance built on dependence always carries the risk of collapse the moment interests no longer align. A nation's sky is not merely a physical space. It is a symbol of ultimate decision-making power. When to take off, when to stand down, and in whose interest. When control of that sky becomes bound by external conditions, no matter how subtle, sovereignty has already begun to slip from our hands, slowly, quietly. The central question, therefore, is not which aircraft we buy or which solution seems more convenient in the short term. The real question is this: who is holding the controls of Canada's national security? Who has the authority to decide when interests no longer coincide, when the world grows harsher, and when easy choices no longer exist? The decisions made today will shape the space of choice for decades to come. They will affect generations who are not present in today's debates, but who will live fully with their consequences. That is why this is not merely a story about government or the military. It is a story about every citizen, because national sovereignty in the end is the sum of the collective choices a society is willing to accept. This sky belongs to us, this tax money belongs to us, and this future must also belong to us. If today we avoid difficult choices, tomorrow we may find that there are no choices left to avoid. If you have your own thoughts, perspectives, or concerns about sovereignty, security, and Canada's future, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Every viewpoint helps make this discussion more complete and more honest. And if you find analyses like this valuable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue together to follow, question, and reflect on the decisions that will shape the world we live in.